All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another HMS Psyche virtual training session, this time with Rory Tassonyi and the life of the midshipman. This is a really interesting piece of our naval heritage across most of the Western European and American countries that have navies. So really excited to hear about this one. As usual, everyone's going to start off on mute, and Rory's going to do his presentation. Please hold your questions to the end, or put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them then. And of course, if you don't get your question answered, feel free to post it on the website. This video will also be posted on our YouTube channel a week from now. So I'm going to hand it over to Rory and let him go at it.
Great, thanks very much, Ryan. Just give me 1 second and I'll pull up my presentation. Great, I think that should now be working for everyone. Great, well, welcome everyone to the presentation on the life of midshipmen. This is a little bit of a gargantuan topic, so I'm gonna try to give you a good overview of what it would have been like to be a midshipman in the Royal Navy, how they would have joined and how they would have advanced. Yeah, I'm just gonna try to go through it. It might be a little bit quick, but I'm trying to save some time for questions at the end. So let's get started. Alrighty, so what is a midshipman? So a midshipman is the lowest ranking officer, and the rank is still used in many of the world's navies today. Originating in the 17th century, the term midshipman was used to denote the most experienced sailor who worked and slept in the middle part of the ship, or amidships. As time went on, the rank of midshipman was increasingly used to describe those with sufficient experience and a desire to be considered for promotion to an officer's rank. By 1794, however, the rank was used exclusively for officer candidates, and the other meanings had fallen out of favor at that point. Apologies, just letting some people into the waiting room. So who were the midshipmen really? Well, to start with their age, the common image that we get are, 6 or 7-year-old boys joining the Navy, not knowing what to do, but leading fully grown men into battle. While there is some truth in this, it's not really the whole picture. Certainly there were young boys who joined as midshipmen, both Lord Horatio Nelson and Sir Sidney Smith, who is pictured here in a portrait from when he was a midshipman, both joined at the age of 13. However, there's also evidence for older midshipmen. Thomas Cochrane, as another example, only joined the Navy as midshipman when he was 17. And if we examine the muster table for the Great Lakes Squadron during the War of 1812, it lists a total of 15 midshipmen and 8 master's mates. The midshipman age ranges from 15 to 35 years old. The average for that group is 24 years old, and the master's mates age from 16 to 26 years old, and the average age among them would be 22. So socioeconomic status was such an important thing during this time period that we don't really have a good sense of today. But during our period, midshipmen mostly came from middle-class families, typically those families that had connections with high-ranking naval officers, and they would decide to put their sons into the naval career and so that they could really capitalize on those connections. The cost of signing aboard as a midshipman, it wasn't insignificant, but it was also less expensive than purchasing a commission in the infantry. The opportunity for prize money and the upward mobility through promotion made the Royal Navy particularly appealing for people who were less affluent. Another percentage of the boys brought on as midshipmen would be the sons of already commissioned officers in the fleet. This was not only due to the family interest in getting them into the Navy, but also because the Royal Naval College, which we will discuss later on, was allotting free spaces to boys who were the sons of commissioned officers. The danger and rigors of a seafaring life made it less suitable for aristocratic youths, especially heirs, to join the Navy. However, there are a few notable examples. Prince William, who became the future King William IV, joined the Navy as a midshipman, and so did Lord Camelford, also known as Thomas Pitt, and he himself was the heir, and he actually went to sea, though it was against the wishes of his father. Generally, however, on the whole, midshipmen were of a higher social class than the ordinary sailor, and this gave rise to them colloquially being called the young gentlemen. So how did these young gentlemen join the Navy? Well, there were a few different paths, but they were generally all linked. So the first system involved apprenticeships at sea. So the system for achieving the rank of midshipman was a little complicated. Before you even achieve the rank of midshipman, you had to have 3 years of experience at sea before attaining that rank. If the midshipman in question didn't have the benefit of patronage, which we will get into a little bit later, he likely would have signed aboard ship as a lesser rank and worked towards becoming a midshipman. Before 1794, he most likely would have entered as an officer's servant. But after 1794, the officer's servant system was abolished. Officers weren't too happy about that. And the rank of volunteer first class was introduced. Now, that rank was targeted for boys between 11 and 13 years old, and they were essentially fast-tracked to becoming midshipmen once their sea time had been fulfilled. Those volunteers first class would have either resided in the gunroom aboard ship or in the midshipman's berth. It depended on the size of the ship, really. The system of apprenticeships at sea allowed captains to educate boys, start training them in the ways of the Royal Navy from their first day on board ship. And it was widely considered to be the best way to get them used to life at sea. Aspiring midshipmen did sign aboard as able seamen, however. In the recorded cases, they were pretty quickly promoted, and we think that they always maintained their distinction as gentlemen and never slept in the same berths as the common sailors. However, I haven't actually found any evidence yet of ordinary sailors being promoted to midshipmen, but if anyone has any sources, I would be happy to have them. Please share them. So the next system, which is closely linked to apprenticeships at sea, is the system of false muster. Now, the false muster system was both very illegal and very widely used. It involved writing a person's name on the muster books of a ship, even though they weren't there. This allowed them to gain the required sea time for their promotion on paper. Thomas Cochrane, pictured here, had been actually on the books of several Royal Navy vessels from the time that he was 5 years old. The system of false muster was usually done by officers who were in command of ships, and it was done to benefit their friends or relatives. This is one of the many benefits that midshipmen with patronage had over their counterparts, which did not have those kinds of connections. So the Royal Naval College was the third and a very different way of getting midshipmen into the Navy. It was originally called the Royal Naval Academy when it was founded in Portsmouth in 1729. It was named, however, the Royal Naval College in 1806 following some fairly big renovations to it. Its purpose was to serve as an alternative means to recruit officers and provide standardized training and education. The program was created for boys aged 13 to 16. There were a total of 70 places at the college. 40 of those places were reserved for the sons of commissioned officers in the naval service, and their tuition was paid by public expense. The remaining 30 places were filled by the sons of, to quote, officers, noblemen, and gentlemen. The boys that entered the Royal Naval College received a theoretical and practical education in seamanship, navigation, and mathematics, as well as instruction in drawing, French, fencing, and dancing over the course of a 3-year period. The boys who graduated from the college would have earned 2 years of sea time, as well as a reduction of time before they could stand for their lieutenant's examination. This would be 4 years instead of the usual 6. Graduates earned the rank of midshipman by order, which morphed into the rank of midshipman ordinary. This was to distinguish them from midshipmen who had been educated at sea, but those midshipmen who were educated at college were actually paid less than those who were trained at sea. Some notable graduates of the Royal Naval College, however, are Philip Broke of HMS Shannon fame, and Francis and Charles Austen, the brothers of the famed author Jane Austen. Generally, however, naval captains did not like the system of the college education. They thought the graduates were kind of useless, and they preferred the older apprenticeship style system of education. So what was life aboard ship really like for these boys? Well, life aboard ship, much of their time was spent either on deck or in the midshipman's berth. Now, in the midshipman's berth, they slept, ate, and passed whatever free time they possibly had. Their berth was typically located in the orlop deck, which is the lowest deck. It's at or beneath the waterline, and it's just above the hold. It's a very dark and cramped space. It has very little fresh air, and it's almost always damp. But because they were officers and they were considered gentlemen, their berth was always in the after part of the ship, similarly to the commissioned officers and the captain. On larger ships of the line, their berth would have been located in the cockpit of the ship. This is the same area where, during battle, the surgeon and his mates formed their surgery and tended to the wounded. A bit of a macabre fact is that the table that the midshipmen ate off of was also doubling as the amputation table during battle. Midshipmen, much as the wardroom officers had, they also had servants to assist them as part of the midshipmen's berth. However, there wouldn't have been many of them, so the mids would likely have had to rely on themselves and each other to accomplish various tasks. As with any group of adolescent young boys living in close quarters, the life wasn't always happy and cheery. There was a lot of fighting, bullying, drunkenness, and general cruelty. And we can see that from an entry in the diary of John Lacouture, who was recounting the experience of Henry Fitzclarence, son of the, well, illegitimate son of the Duke of Clarence, who had been completely ill-used by the midshipmen, and they had destroyed all of his belongings. So sleeping arrangements, as I mentioned before, midshipmen would sleep in the midshipman's berth. They would typically sleep in hammocks. Sometimes they would have been the regular style of hammocks, or more likely, they would have been these cot-style hammocks that you see pictured. These were reserved for officer use, and sometimes Marines would also be issued them. The midshipmen would also have been issued basic bedding, but they could have purchased extra items from the purser, or they could have brought items with them from home. Now, the basic bedding that they would have had would have consisted of a straw-packed mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a bolster or a pillow. The bedding would have belonged to the midshipmen, and it would have traveled with them between ships when they were transferred, or if they were serving on shore. So what did the midshipmen eat? Typically, the midshipmen would eat the exact same rations as the sailors. Though, because they were officers, they had the ability to provision for themselves with personal food items to either improve the flavor of the daily rations or to augment the daily rations. They also had the privilege of occasionally deciding when and how their rations should be cooked. So there's a quote from Ragersfeld, not a quote, but a remark, that he mentions that the mids that he served with decided to save their Saturday ration of meat, which would have been boiled for the sailors, and they decided to have it roasted for Sunday dinner instead. The midshipmen, as mirroring their superior officers, often formed a mess. This was a communal system for procuring food and dining together. Each new midshipman would be required or obligated to pay into the mess, and then things would have been purchased communally. So when midshipman David Wingfield made his way along the St. Lawrence towards Kingston, Ontario, with the rest of Commodore Yo's force during 1813, they were tempted, and they did in fact form their mess at a local woman's house, and they purchased a calf from her, but they were also obliged to slaughter and butcher it themselves, with mixed results. We also have evidence of midshipmen bringing utensils, crockery, and other goods with them on board. However, as it's recounted several times, whatever they brought on board with them would often be seized by the other midshipmen and be put towards the common good or used communally in the mess. Some of the items that they would have taken, as we can see, would have been plates, spoons made of pewter, forks, knives, cooking kettles, frying pans, tea kettles, tumbler glasses, decanters, and cups and saucers. Another note on feeding. Midshipmen would also have found other more scrupulous ways of gaining more food, mostly by engaging in cutting out expeditions, as they termed them, which would be to steal food from the captain or wardroom's table. If they were successful, it was a point of pride and honor. But if they were caught, then they were severely punished. And leading into this discussion on punishment, aside from the typical bullying and beatings, fights that other boys would give each other in the mess or in the midshipman's berth, the punishments that midshipmen received were always at the discretion of their captain, and it was his job to decide the severity. So some of the punishments that were allotted for midshipmen included mastheading, disrating, being turned before the mast, being flogged, and being turned out of the service altogether. So what would the duties of a midshipman have been on board ship? Well, the tasks they were given were pretty varied and quite numerous, but mostly it depended on the age, experience, and competence of the midshipmen, and also their trustworthiness. So generally speaking, they acted in a support role to the lieutenants of the ship, and they performed similar duties to the lieutenants, but on a much smaller scale. They also would be put in charge of duties that would aid their education as seamen or officers. So whatever the commissioned officers deemed important for them to do. So some examples of tasks that midshipmen were responsible for were overseeing subdivisions, provisioning for the ship, standing watches with the lieutenants or on their own if they were capable, relaying orders, overseeing maintenance or sail handling tasks, commanding batteries of guns, and commanding small boats. So in terms of their education, no matter what their background had been, whether they had attended the Naval College or not, midshipmen were still expected to be educated on board ship. They were expected to, again, learn the navigation, mathematics, writing, and any minor subjects that related to those fields, because they were important to the profession. They were also each expected to keep a personal copy of the ship's log as part of their education. And this is an example of a ship's log from, I believe, 1762. Depending on the size of the ship and their education, quality. It may have been in charge of either a previously passed midshipman or master's mate. It may have been under the governance of the commissioned officers of the ship, or if the ship was large enough, it may have had a chaplain or a schoolmaster to oversee their education. So the rank and pay of midshipmen, their rank is a little vague in the naval hierarchy. They may have been considered senior petty officers. They may have been considered warrant officers. However, they had a superiority of rank that was enforced over warrant officers. And it's demonstrated in the occasional notes you get of warrant officers being disciplined for offenses to midshipmen, and they're entered as offenses against a superior officer. However, that being said, midshipmen were paid less than warrant officers, and they received a smaller share of the prize money. Midshipmen were paid £2, 5 shillings per month, and master's mates were paid £3, 16 shillings per month. Apologies, forgot to throw that in. Now, when it comes to advancement through the ranks of the Navy, midshipmen who had reached the adequate level of skills would be put forward for examination by either their commanding officer or, slightly less often, by someone who was connected to them. This was another benefit of the patronage that some midshipmen benefited from. The minimum age for examination was between 19 and 20 years old. However, it was the goal of many young officers, young midshipmen at that point, to stand for their examination at 17 or 18. Applicants standing for the examination had to have 6 years at sea, and 3 of those 6 years had to be as a midshipman. They would be asked to provide proof of their service, including signed certificates from their commander and the journals that they had maintained as midshipmen, including the ship's log that we discussed before. The examinations were conducted by a board of at least 3 captains, and the examination was conducted orally. This system of examination was to ensure that every officer holding a commission was professionally competent enough to command any of His Majesty's ships. And this was mostly because ships during the period were a huge investment on the part of the government of materials and money and manpower, and it jump-started a lot of the industrialization that we see in the period. And this is the same reason that commanding officers who lost their ship were put on court-martial to ascertain if they were liable for the loss of the ship. Now, if a midshipman was away from a home port for an extended period of time, he could be passed by a provisional examination made up of officers of the fleet or station that the midshipman was on. The quality of these provisional examinations varied widely. Some were just as rigorous as the home port examination for lieutenant, while others may have just been a casual chat, and they would have been granted the rank upon completion of that. The success in the provisional examination conferred the rank of acting mate. However, to achieve the full rank of mate and be eligible for a lieutenancy, he would have had to pass his actual examination within 3 months of returning to England. Upon successfully completing their examination, they would then hold the rank of a passed midshipman until such a time that they received a lieutenant's commission. Passing the examination was in no way a guarantee of a promotion to lieutenant, and quite often passed midshipmen became master's mates because there was an increase in responsibility, but more importantly, there was an increase in pay and the increase in the shares of the prize money. And that is essentially how a midshipman entered the Navy, conducted their daily life, and then advanced out of it. And these are some of the sources that I used for my research. And that concludes my presentation. So I'll open it up to any questions now. And let me just return the host privileges to Ryan. There we go.
Thanks, Rory. That was fantastic. Well done. Yeah, I'm just going to open up to questions. So what I've got to do here is I've got to allow participants to unmute themselves. Done. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and then fire away or throw it in the chat and we'll try to get you an answer.
Hello. So my question has to do with a period right after you were talking about, Rory.
Mm-hmm.
And that is after William became king, is it true that he decreed that naval officers did not have to stand for toasts, that they could remain seated? Do you know?
I actually believe that was earlier than King William. I believe that was King George III gave that decree because at one point he was dining on board one of the flagships and everyone stood and there was a bit of heavy weather and I think they all fell over. Don't quote me on that. I'm a little hazy, but I can find that information for you. Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's definitely a tradition that still persists in the Navy.
Is that so? Good.
Yeah, yeah. We're the only service permitted to remain seated during a royal toast.
Is that true in the Canadian service as well?
I'm not sure if it's transferred over to the Canadian service because I'm not sure how many toasts the Canadian service gives to the monarch.
Well, must be one occasionally.
I'm sure there is, yes.
I
hope so.
I'm just a Yankee. I live in Washington State, so.
Yeah.
But
anyway. I have a few contacts in the Canadian Navy right now, so I can ask them and I'll get back to you.
I would like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Roy, the next question was actually from Girth. He was wondering where your background came from and who did it and what.
Yes.
And when was it done?
Yes. So actually, this is a guilty, it's sort of a secret fact. Most of the images that I used in this presentation, including this one, were painted in the 1820s and 30s. Now, the reason for this is interesting. They're all linked to the naval officers of our period during the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars coming back and writing about their experiences. And these were illustrations done to accompany their books that they had written. So while they were done 10, 20 years later, they were done to capture and emulate the midshipmen's berths and the scenes from our time period. I will get the exact name of the painter for this one, but I believe this one was painted in 1822. Yeah.
What were the midshipmen's responsibilities during battle?
So the midshipmen would typically have been put in charge of a subdivision of men, and within that subdivision, they likely would have been in charge of gun batteries. So it may have been one gun or it may have been 3 or 4. It depended on the size of the ship and how many midshipmen and lieutenants they had. But whereas a lieutenant would oversee a whole division of guns, the midshipmen would be scattered throughout that division to keep an eye on it. Midshipmen may also have been put in charge of boarding parties or various other things. It depends on the action exactly. Also, younger ones may have been put in charge of relaying orders between the decks.
Have you read or seen any accounts of young girls who disguise themselves to become midshipmen?
There are a few accounts of girls disguising themselves to become sailors, but there aren't any that I came across of girls disguising themselves to be midshipmen specifically. There was a great fiction series that I read, the Jackie Faber novels, in which it was great because she went aboard as a ship's boy, and then her captain promoted her to midshipman. I haven't found any evidence, but it's possible that it's out there and it just may never have been written down.
What kind of small arms would the midshipmen carry?
So typically, this is actually going to be the subject of an upcoming presentation I'm going to give, but typically midshipmen would have been issued dirks, which were small, about 12 to 15-inch long blades. And they would have been given this mostly because midshipmen, if they were coming in at 13 years old or 14 years old, they wouldn't be able to handle a full-sized weapon as effectively. Midshipmen, they're also noted as bringing personal arms on board. If they had a gun that they had brought from home, it may have been permitted with the captain's permission. But otherwise, midshipmen would have been taking the issue of arms out of the armory along with the sailors if they needed anything beyond their dirk, which was typically a requirement of their dress uniform.
Tim, does that answer your question? I see you got your hand up still.
No, I just had it up just so it catch your attention. I'll put it down.
Cool. All right, we have 7 minutes left. Rory, I have a question for you. You had shown us a quote of a party, a mess of midshipmen who had made it to Kingston.
Yes.
And the one midshipman who was recording the event, it sounds like he didn't even get his share of the calf. Can you tell us a bit more about that story?
He doesn't go into a lot of detail. So that came out of the diary of Lieutenant David Wingfield. He was a midshipman at the time, and he was only promoted and confirmed. He was confirmed a lieutenant in 1815. But this was when they were actually traveling along the St. Lawrence at the time. They were on their way to Kingston. And the way that he describes it is they bought this calf from this woman whose house they were essentially crashing in, just sleeping on the floor in front of the fireplace. And because all of the sailors that they were in charge of were either engaged in other tasks or they were drunk at the time, the midshipmen were the ones who had to kill the calf and butcher it somehow. The only thing he says is that they did it after a fashion, which I can only assume means that you had a group of probably about 6 or 7 teenagers arguing about the best way to do it. And by the end of it, they're completely covered in blood and they all have, different bits of meat that they're just sticking over top of a fire on a stick. I don't have high hopes for them. But yeah.
Gareth, you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, Rory, from in the depictions of the midshipmen in either of the movies, Master Commander or in the Hornblower series, were those accurate depictions, would you say?
I would say certain things are definitely accurate. Quite a lot of things are pretty accurate, and there are some inaccuracies in there. I think that they misled people with, the whole, if you wanted to be a seaman boy, you should have started at 12, that they say in the Hornblower series. And, Jack Aubrey's surprise at Hollum being, nearly 30 years old in the film Master Commander Far Side of the World. I think that sort of occurrence would have been pretty common, especially given the force that Yo was sent with was in their mid-20s, really. But I think generally they captured the essence of what midshipmen were in charge of and how they interacted with each other really well.
Lieutenant Juan is asking, do we have any records of U.S. midshipmen?
Yes, that was a little beyond the scope of mine, but the US also had a midshipman rank and their uniform was quite similar. They pretty much did the exact same jobs that these midshipmen did. I believe that the American midshipmen went through a title change where for a time, they weren't called midshipmen, they were called sub-lieutenants, or there was something in there. I'd have to look into it more. I wasn't focusing on the US Navy. Mm-hmm.
Jason has given us a piece of advice or thought as to Wingfield, and suggests he was imprisoned at Frankfort, Kentucky for a while, and that there's maybe 2 or 3 locations in Ontario named after him.
I know there's at least one. There's a whole bay. He has a bay named after him. I forget where exactly it is in Ontario. But yeah, he was actually imprisoned all over the U.S. I'm reading the journal right now, and he essentially gets shipped around everywhere. Every few days, he gets moved on, and he loses his baggage, and he's separated from his friends, and he has run-ins with the prisoner exchange authority, and the British prisoners nearly lead a revolt where they refuse to, move on to another prison without having their breakfast first, and various things like that. It's a very entertaining read.
I'm glad that you've become the authoritative source on the subject. It's been a fantastic presentation. Unfortunately, we're just running out of time here, so I'll give you some closing remarks. We will post this presentation on our YouTube channel next Wednesday, and our next presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, Girth, is actually the Dirk presentation.
If that is between what you and Rory had decided, because I know you had offered to do your the different styles of ships rigs as well. But if Rory, if you're up to do your presentation on Dirks in 2 weeks, that'd be great.
Sure. One way or another, you're going to get a great presentation next week, hopefully as good as this one. So again, check out our website, check out our YouTube channel. We're ever increasing our presence on the internet, and we're adding more and more content and great information every day. So I encourage you to stay involved in the hobby and stay in touch with us. Ask us any questions on the Facebook group or through our email, hmspsyche@gmail.ca. Our website is www.hmspsyche.ca, and we've got some great information there as well as our pictures from the last 3 or 4 years. Girth?
Just a little correction. Isn't the email hmspsyche@gmail.com?
Yeah, what did I say?
.ca.
Oh, sorry.
But the website is hmspsyche.ca.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Thank you, Girth. All right, everyone. Have yourselves a fantastic evening and maintain a positive psyche.